Hello and welcome to the overview of Chapter 15, Chapter 32 in the book, and this is looking at labor markets, unemployment, and inflation. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mr. Rodman here to take you through this overview. We're going to look at the natural rate of unemployment. We're going to look at cyclical unemployment, differences between the two, as well as look at minimum wages and efficiency wages and how these can lead to structural unemployment. We'll also look at the natural rate of unemployment and how that leads to highs and lows in the unemployment process, as well as trade-offs that we make between unemployment and inflation, leading us to the short-run Phillips Curve, and why that trade-off isn't a trade-off in the long run. And then we'll wrap it up looking at nehru, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, and how it is used in terms of comparing it to where inflation is going, or where inflation may be headed in terms of unemployment. There are some really great explainers on unemployment here that you can check out. I would encourage you to take a look at them. From Khan Academy, you're going to love Economics, ACDC Econ, and Welkernomics. So do check those out, some more explainers on unemployment as we head through it. So let's look at the nature of unemployment. We start by looking at the labor force participation rate. How do we calculate unemployment? Well, we need to know who's in the labor force. Take that labor force, divide it by the population that is over 16, and you get the labor force participation rate. This is 61.4% right now as of March 2021. And we then take that number from the labor force and we divide the number of unemployed workers, those that are actually seeking work but cannot find it, divide that by the labor force, those that are participating in the labor force, and we get a number of 6.3%. So those individuals who are looking for work and can't find it versus those who are actually working, it's about 6.3% in terms of the gap there. And that's down a little bit from where we were. Obviously, from a year ago, it's down significantly. It was at almost 15%. And that is quite a change from where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. Now let's distinguish between frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and cyclical unemployment. Frictional unemployment is just you're in between jobs. You've quit a job, you're going to find one pretty easily, and you're just in between jobs. Therefore, you're frictionally unemployed. It could be that you got laid off, or you got fired, or you quit. Lots of reasons for that: a reduction in force, a plant closed, or whatever. But you're frictionally unemployed. You're going to bounce back pretty quickly. That's not really an issue here. That's frictional unemployment, and is about 1% of the unemployment rate that we see traditionally in the natural rate of unemployment, 1 to 2% at most. What we're going to see with structural unemployment is that you are losing, if you're losing a job and you're becoming unemployed, that structurally the jobs that existed for you don't exist anymore. And that's a problem, because that means you're going to have to retrain your skills. Maybe it's go back to school. Maybe it's take some job training programs. Maybe it's move to another part of the country or the world where your skills are in demand. And so structural unemployment is usually in the 3 to 4% range in terms of what we see here, because these are people that their skills are outdated. And they do need some change. When we experience recession, a lot of times the significant numbers in terms of those that are out of work, a lot of times we really see the evidence of structural unemployment in that regard. Cyclical unemployment is just it follows the business cycle, and you're familiar with that from the last chapter in looking at when we have recession, unemployment rises, of course, because real GDP is falling, people are losing their jobs, and that's very cyclical. As the economy expands and enters the recovery period, you'll see the unemployment rate fall, because the number of people being hired again is going to grow, is going to improve. But let's go back to structural unemployment for a second, just to talk a little bit about why we see some of the structural unemployment that we do. A lot of it isn't just the job training and the skills. Sometimes it's because of other factors. And Krugman goes into some detail here about some of the reasons why people are structurally unemployed. When employers are paying minimum wages, government-mandated price floors for workers, they're less inclined to provide workers with more benefits, such as additional professional development or job training. And the reason for that is because they're spending more providing price floors, providing minimum wages. So a lot of times we see those as fringe benefits that companies provide, but sometimes employers, when they have to cut costs, well, that's one of the first places they go is to cut the cost of professional development or job training, additional skills, going back to school and getting a second degree or something like that. Are lots of cases where businesses kind of close up that option for workers. And if the employer's not paying for it, it's a lot harder for a worker to justify doing it if there's no incentive for them to do so. And so that's why we see some structural unemployment there. People are less inclined to go back to school for that sort of thing. Unions and collective bargaining is another aspect. They get higher wages for workers, but the employers are less likely to provide those types of benefits we just talked about. And so because they're spending more with these higher wages, employers are less likely to grant those types of benefits. And we see that as another reason. Again, not always, but that is another reason in terms of causes of structural unemployment. A couple of other things that lead to this is competition, the idea of efficiency wages. Why we talked about this in class, but why does Costco charge more than the minimum wage? They said we've heard all the political back and forth on the minimum wage being raised to $15 an hour, and there was some political dialogue about that in Congress back with the last stimulus bill. That was kind of taken out of that bill. But the idea here is when you have efficiency wages, Costco said we've been paying $15 an hour for years to our entry-level workers, and the reason for that is because they want to keep those employees. Now, other employers are going to have to look at what Costco is doing and say, well, if we want to attract Costco's employees, we're going to have to offer efficiency wages too. And so this tends to lead to some structural unemployment because they're looking specifically for people and willing to pay for it, but looking for people that have specific skills. And if you don't have those skills, they're not going to hire you. And that is significant because it really creates a chasm between those that have the skills and have invested in job training and furthering their professional development and using those skills throughout their experiences to get better jobs, and those who don't do that and then end up structurally unemployed without the skills they need, and then they're sitting on the unemployment line because of it. One of the last aspects to look at in terms of structural unemployment is this idea of government regulation or policies that are in place. I mentioned job training as one of the areas in which government really tries to step in order to provide job training partnerships and job training skills-based approaches to encourage people to get use those tools from the government in order to better their skills. That isn't always an easy thing to get people to do. Many of them are rejecting that notion because they don't have the time or the money. They need to go out and get a job. They need to get it now. So it can have some side effects in terms of the people who really need it aren't the ones that are going out and getting those jobs or getting those skills. And that is problematic for structural unemployment because, again, it creates an even larger chasm between those that have the skills and can find new work and those that truly are structurally unemployed because they lack the skills and the training that would help them to get a better job. Let's take a look at the natural rate of unemployment. This is the idea that we have an actual rate of unemployment, and the natural rate kind of fluctuates around that in terms of the highs and the lows. So the natural rate of unemployment is looking at what do we see over time that the rate of unemployment is doing. It's pretty level, if you will, in terms of that straight line that we see here. But the actual unemployment rate isn't quite such a straight line. And the actual unemployment rate is more of this roller coaster that we see in this picture here. It is more cyclical in a lot of ways, and that leads us to our cyclical unemployment. Our actual unemployment rate can go up significantly, it can go down significantly, It really just depends on the business cycle, on what's going on at the time. And so that is significant because it creates this gap, what we call an output gap, between what the natural rate of unemployment is and what the actual unemployment rate is as a result of this business cycle, of this deviation between the two. And that output gap can tell us a lot about how the economy is doing and whether additional government assistance is needed in order to help get people back to work and back on the job. Now, some things that can affect this natural rate of unemployment are things like the labor force and characteristics around the labor force. That is significant here because how you are classifying people in terms of who is in the labor force and who isn't can be significant here. If you are classified as a member of the labor force and you're getting new skills and you're improving, that's great for you. But what if you're one of the ones who isn't, and that's and you're lacking those skills, and that's an important aspect because many times people aren't included in that labor force for whatever reason. The experienced workers gain more knowledge and gain more possibilities, and it opens a lot more doors for them than we see with those who don't have those skills. And so structural unemployment can lead to changes in the natural rate of unemployment because of the fact that I mentioned Elkhart, Indiana, my hometown, had a significant unemployment rate, almost over 25% in the Great Recession of 2008-2009. And the reason for this was not because they didn't have people who were willing to work, but because they lacked the skills. And those labor force characteristics in that area led to a much higher unemployment rate. And so the natural rate of unemployment for that area was much higher than the rest of the country. President Obama saw this. His economic advisors saw this, and they sought out Elkhart as an example to see where they could actually change the unemployment rate significantly just by bringing in some job training and job training skills. So that labor force characteristics category is really important in terms of how it changes the natural rate of unemployment. Institutions, we've kind of talked about these already, but the idea of unions, strong labor unions, and working for and fighting for better wages, all of these can affect the natural rate of unemployment. If there's a strong labor presence in terms of union negotiation, that can have a significant impact on the natural rate of unemployment and actually increase it in a lot of ways because employers are less willing to hire people if they have to pay those higher wages. So that has a significant impact on the natural rate of unemployment here. Government policies, I mentioned the job training programs, minimum wages, changing the minimum wage, hiking the minimum wage. All of those things can impact the natural rate of unemployment because, again, the more an employer has to pay, the less likely they're going to be hiring additional workers. I mean, do the math. If I'm paying more for a worker, instead of hiring 10 workers, maybe I'm hiring 8 workers or 7 workers. So I'm not hiring as many of them. And that can lead, in an area that is significantly pro-union, that can lead to employers either leaving that area, leaving workers with a higher unemployment rate, a natural rate of unemployment, or hiring fewer of them. And that is significant in terms of changes that can be made here to the natural rate of unemployment. The last one is productivity. And this is the idea of using technology. And by technology, I don't just mean computers, but I mean technological skills in terms of doing things faster, better, cheaper, smarter, and in all capacities to improve productivity. This can change the natural rate of unemployment. In some ways, this can actually improve the natural rate of unemployment. It can actually lead to more people working if there's better technology. Now, in some cases, we've heard where, computers are taking over, robots are replacing humans and that sort of thing. But I would say the jobs that are created as a result of that are actually higher skilled jobs. And so there may not be as many of them, but the jobs that are there are highly skilled jobs that pay more and lead to greater longevity in those positions because of the skills that those people have. So these are reasons that can change the natural rate of unemployment in terms of what we see here. Okay, now I want to move to talk for a second about unemployment as it relates to this business cycle. We can see over time that with recessions, this is very cyclical. I mean, look at those gray lines and look at the peaks in unemployment. They really are a one-to-one match in terms of the rates, the relationships between those peaks in unemployment and the end of recessions. So you can almost mirror and you can almost tie as a one-to-one the peaks in unemployment and the end of a recession. As those unemployment rates start to drop, recession is ending, and that's a really good thing. But it also shows us that this is of concern because it's easily detectable. When unemployment starts to rise, your concern is that hey, are we headed for a recession? We definitely saw that in 2020. When businesses started to close, lay off workers, not sure if they're going to be able to hire people back or when they're going to even open their doors. All of this led to a very, very big concerns about unemployment and recession. And we can see that peaked at just under 15% and really showcased the data that unemployment shows us about the health of the economy. You really can look at this and get a good sense as to whether the economy is healthy or not based on these numbers. So this is why economists really look at unemployment as an important part of the business cycle. This output gap I mentioned between the natural rate of unemployment and actual unemployment rate is really outlined in this graph, and I love this this graph from the Krugman text because it shows you the differences between what that natural rate of unemployment normally is and what it actually is. What actually happens. You can see those recessions. If we were to overlay the last graph, the last chart, with the one we see here, we would see that the output gap is much greater in recessions, where those peaks and valleys are. And that is significant here, because that really shows us the impact that unemployment has on the business cycle, on recession, on the health of the economy. And the idea here is where do we want to be? Well, we want to aim for the natural rate of unemployment. We want unemployment to be lower than what it actually is, and try and keep it there. And we'll talk about this in relation to inflation here in a second. But that is the goal. That's not always what happens, as we can see in some of these trends. And you can see the output gap here in relation to that cyclical unemployment. Sometimes is much greater. You look at the 60s. In which we had a lot of government programs and government intervention and monies that were going into fighting a war, going into fighting Vietnam, but also a lot of domestic programs through the Great Society, the President Johnson's initiatives around the Great Society that was funneling a lot of money into the economy, into programs, leading to a very low cyclical unemployment rate, and much lower than what the rate would normally be. And so we can see that has an impact when governments spend money. We know it shifts AD. We know it's the G in sign in terms of looking for a sign of shifting AD. But this really shows us that. The impact that it has here. And it's important to note, as we look at this, the idea of Odens Law. When we're putting money into an economy, and we can use the money that government is spending to change in the output gap in terms of what we're producing and what we're capable of, who's unemployed and who isn't. That output gap we were talking about, every time you see an additional percentage point in the output gap in terms of the actual versus the unemployment rate. We can every time you're improving GDP, you're reducing unemployment. There's an inverse relationship there. And Odens Law just basically says the more you're growing your economy, the less you have to worry about unemployment, which is really the concept behind this. If you're growing your GDP and more money is going into producing goods and services that are being sold in your country or abroad through net exports, that is helping to reduce your unemployment rate because more people are working, more people are producing those goods and services, and that's reducing the unemployment rate that we see here. So there is a relationship, inversely, but there is a relationship between GDP and unemployment in that fashion. We're going to talk in a second about how there's a relationship in terms of unemployment and inflation then, and how these three really all tie together. We can see this again in the chart we looked at before, these fluctuations, that output gap I was talking about. If it is a positive output gap, that inflationary gap, we can see that the unemployment rate is going to be below the natural rate. So this is what we're seeing down in here in the 60s I mentioned early 70s. We didn't see that in the late 70s, going into the oil crisis, going into stagflation. We had a negative or recessionary gap, a negative output gap here in the late 70s. And that led to a rise, an increase in unemployment that was much higher than what the cyclical unemployment rate would have been. That is difficult in terms of addressing the needs of trying to reduce unemployment and improve GDP. GDP was falling, unemployment's rising. So think of it like a seesaw. It really is when it relates to unemployment and GDP. If unemployment is falling, your GDP is rising. If your unemployment is rising, your GDP is falling. And that really is the relationship that we see there. Now, why is it that it takes so long for the labor market to move to equilibrium in terms of these unemployment rates and what we're seeing here in terms of output gaps? Some reasons, obviously misperceptions. I think the conception of what a worker should be paid sometimes is lagging. And this is all due to lag. All of these main theories are about lags. The idea here is if workers don't realize what they're worth and they don't speak up in order to get that money, then they are disadvantaged, and employers are able to take advantage of that, and they're able to make more profits from it. When workers realize what they're worth and say, "Hey, I want more money," then employers either get on board, or the employee usually leaves and goes to find something else where they're paid what they're worth. Sticky wages, same thing. When workers are being paid and they're paid in the short run, those wages are sticky. So in good times they're making less, in bad times they're making more. But those, as we know, don't stay there. SRAS shifts in the long run, either to higher wages or lower wages, depending on the positive or negative output gaps that we're looking at here. And then the last one is menu costs. You could also look at shoe leather costs here in terms of how much does it cost to change a menu, how much does it cost to in shoe leather to go run to the bank in order to get more cash. All of these things have an impact in terms of why the labor market is slow to react to bring employment wages to equilibrium. If there is a cost and an effort in changing menu prices, there's going to be a lag. If people have to run to the bank in order to get cash in order to pay for something, there's going to be a lag. And so that's what we see here over and over again in terms of why is it that the labor market is lagging in reaching equilibrium on wages. It's because of these issues. All right, so now let's take a look at, we talked about the relationship between GDP and unemployment. Now I want to look at the relationship between unemployment and inflation. So really kind of tying all three of these issues together in terms of looking at how do we measure the health of the economy. And this is important because you may remember back in Unit 2, when we looked at the big picture of macroeconomics, we talked about some causes of inflation, this idea of demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. And you may remember I graphed this out in class. The idea of demand pull inflation here is AD is increasing. Aggregate demand is moving outward or rightward. And that leads SRAS to move along the curve to a higher price level. So real GDP is growing. That's wonderful. But you have an inflationary gap because workers' wages are going up. And that's leading to this demand pull inflation. Too many dollars chasing too few goods. That's demand pull inflation. Demand is essentially pulling up those prices that we see there. And again, when in doubt, graph it out. With cost push inflation, it's different because this is the resource costs we're talking about. And when inflation is at work here, that is cost push, the idea is it costs more for the resources that we're using, that we're pulling out of the ground, capital-intensive resources, whatever the case may be. And that means SRAS is shifting leftward or inward. When SRAS shifts leftward or inward, again, AD moves along the curve, and it's going to move to a higher price level. This is also stagflation, if you remember from the key graphs. That stagflation is leading to higher price levels and smaller real GDP, which is that recessionary gap that we have talked about, or that negative output gap. Prices are rising, but real GDP is not. It is actually falling. And that's significant here because whether it's demand pull or cost push, inflation is something we definitely want to keep an eye on. Now, we haven't had an enormous amount of pressure on this over the last 10 years in the economic recovery since the recession of 2009, but it is something that economists pay attention to, and the reason for that is because of what we call the Phillips Curve, the idea that there's a relationship, an inverse relationship to unemployment and inflation. I mentioned the inverse relationship between unemployment and GDP. We have something similar, similar yet different, between inflation and unemployment. So when real GDP grows, do we have to worry about inflation? Well, you might. When unemployment falls, do you have to worry about inflation? Well, the Phillips curve says we do. In the short run, we have to be careful here because we don't want to trade off too low of unemployment for rising prices to the point that we get stagflation, to the point that we end up in a stagflationary type of environment. And that was the concerns of the 1960s that Krugman talks about in the textbook. This relationship, this downward sloping demand curve in terms of the SRPC, the short run Phillips curve, in terms of this trade-off between inflation and unemployment. In the early 1960s, you had a higher unemployment rate. Well, they were able to get people back to work. There were a lot of, again, as I mentioned, Great Society programs from the early 60s into the late 60s. But the problem there is all of that money, too much money chasing too few goods, led to a hot economy and a higher inflation rate. And so then by the end of the 60s, you have a much higher inflation rate. You don't have to worry about unemployment. It's pretty low, but you do have to worry about inflation at that point. And that gave really credence to this idea of this Phillips curve. So what is the Phillips curve? It is an inverse relationship with key graph 29. It is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. When inflation is high, unemployment is low in the short run. When unemployment is high, inflation is low. And there are trade-offs between the two. And so that's what we tend to see here. It is downward sloping, much like a demand curve would be, an aggregate demand curve would be. And the idea is that in the short run, at least, when we have high unemployment, we don't usually have to worry too much about inflation. Likewise, when we have high inflation, we're less concerned about unemployment. There are exceptions to that rule, as you're going to see in the next key graph, but the idea there is an inverse relationship in the short run. Now, in the long run, there's no relationship between the two. In the long run, they are separate entities, and we'll talk about why that is here in just a second. But this is the trade-offs, the relationships that's being made here. In key graph 30, we can see that recessionary gap or that stagflation that we talked about. And so this is kind of a graph-in-graph key graph, which I love. By showing the recessionary gap up there, SRAS is moving inward, leading to that smaller real GDP, a shrinking real GDP, which leads us to a recessionary gap. Again, if we have 2 quarters of that, we would be in recession. So for now, it's just a gap. But notice that the price level is rising. That's the stagflation part of it. And so what we see here is price levels rising, real GDP falling, and this is leading to higher prices and higher unemployment. So wait a minute, I thought you said there was an inverse relationship between the two. Well, remember I said there are exceptions. Well, this is one of them, and that is when there's a shift of the SRPC, when there's a shift of the curve. And that's what we see in this example. This idea of the unemployment rate rising because we've got smaller GDP, but we have prices rising too. That's a shift of SRPC. That's a shift of the curve. And so SRPC moves from SRPC to SRPC1, and that tells us that we have higher prices, greater unemployment, and the concern there is that we are going to find ourselves in a supply shock, in stagflationary supply shock like Jimmy Carter did in the 1970s. And what are we seeing over the last 10 years? Well, we actually saw the opposite of this. We actually saw the SRPC curve actually move inward or leftward. Inflation's low, unemployment's low. Hey, win-win situation, right? Well, not always. What you have to remember is we also spent a lot of deficit spending in order to get that SRPC shifted leftward. Somebody's eventually going to have to pay for that. That's $28 trillion right there. Don't pull out your checkbooks just yet, because the idea there is that while that may be there for a short period of time to keep inflation low, to keep unemployment low, that is going to be hard to maintain, hard to keep up with. So an increase in expected inflation could shift the short-run Phillips curve here. Now, the actual inflation rate at any given unemployment rate is going to be higher when the expected inflation rate is higher. So the idea of expectations is important here. If people expect that the inflation rate is going to be higher, then that's leaning into this shift in the SRPC, and that's what we see here in this key graph. The final key graph that we have in this chapter is key graph 31, and this is the long-run Phillips curve, and this is showing you what we saw in key graph 29, the short-run Phillips curve, but now we've applied the long-run Phillips curve, or the LRPC, to this, and this is basically showing us that in the long run, there's no connection between inflation and unemployment. While we may think that there is in the short run, and usually the reason for this is because anytime unemployment is below, and the number we use here is usually 6%. If it's below 5 to 6%, we're going to see inflation. But once unemployment gets above that, there's really no concern about inflation at that point. And so it's more at this what we call the nehru, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which we'll talk about here in a second. But in the long run, there's no relationship here between the two. Inflation is in and of itself a factor, and unemployment is as well. And that's what we see here in this example. So expected inflation, as I mentioned, important to note here. The idea of expected inflation in the short-run Phillips curve is really that the actual inflation rate at any given unemployment rate is going to be higher when the expected inflation rate is higher. And that's really what we're talking about here. So if there's an expectation that inflation is going to rise, then it probably will. And that is enough to shift the curve, leading to that higher inflation. Again, it's got to be below that 6% that we were talking about. But in terms of the unemployment rate, but the idea here is that is the only time you would really have to worry about inflation when unemployment is that low. That's really the concerns, and economists usually take a look at that as well. If it's below 5 or 6%, they're more concerned about inflation than when unemployment is higher. Our number right now is about 6.3%, as we talked about at the beginning of this overview. And that is much less than it was, but you can see that the Fed and Congress and the President less concerned about inflation than they are about unemployment. It's unemployment that's really the number, is those 9.9 million people that don't have jobs. How do we get them jobs? That's really the key that we're looking at here. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of nehru, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, and look at it in a little more detail. But let's look at long-run Phillips curve, because we just kind of introduced that concept in the last key graph. Now, notice that the long-run Phillips curve reminds us that there's no relationship between unemployment and inflation. Okay, that's creating the vertical line that we talked about here. So looking back at this is the vertical line that is created. But it's important to note that because there's no trade-off between unemployment and inflation in the long run, you need some time to adjust those expectations. Okay, and that's why long run there's really no there's really no impact. Now short run, different story, and that's where we can see a shifting SRPC. When we're looking at what's going to happen with unemployment and inflation, well, it depends on where we are. In the short run, that can be much more volatile than it is in the long run because of the idea of those expectations. And this slide probably does a better job in explaining that. But it's important to note the nehru, or where we are at full employment. Most economists peg that at about 5 to 6%. 6%, I think, is what Krugman uses. I think 5% is about what economists today use as full employment in terms of a natural rate. Think about that in terms of where are we at full employment at long-run aggregate supply, right? Where is long-run aggregate supply? It's at full employment. And where is that? Usually at 5%. So nehru, this non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, is the unemployment rate in which inflation doesn't change over time, okay? And essentially it is going to be equal to the natural rate of unemployment. Again, and this is only when you have an unemployment rate below 6%, okay? So that's where you're concerned about inflation. Above that, no inflationary worries. You're more worried about jobs, worried about getting people to work. And that's really the driver there. So the idea is that inflation will accelerate if the unemployment rate falls below that nehru level. And that comes from Milton Friedman, supply-side economics. He's really focused on that. But again, not all economists buy into that. Some of them are skeptical that this even exists in the short run. Many of them look at it and say inflation and unemployment not necessarily relatable, but this is what we look at in the short run in terms of trying to address unemployment and inflation in that time period in terms of what we see there. There are a couple of really good activities that we'll be doing in class. Activity 5-8 looks at this in terms of what aggregate demand has an impact on real GDP and unemployment, wages and price levels, doing some graphing there. And activity 5-9 looks at long-run and short-run Phillips curves in this capacity. And I think I would encourage you to check those out in terms of what that's addressing there. Also, in the Google Slides, there are summaries of the entire chapter that you can check out, some key terms, as I mentioned, and then explainers that will help in taking you through it one more time in terms of that relationship in determining what the unemployment rate is, as well as that relationship to inflation, whether or not it exists in the short run, and definitely not in the long run. Okay, and here are the answers to the take-home quiz study questions from Chapter 32. You can see those here. You can pause the video if you like. I hope you found this helpful in this overview of labor markets, inflation, and unemployment, looking at the short-run and long-run Phillips curves. And we'll be back in the next chapter as we look at inflation in more detail, looking at inflation, disinflation, and deflation. What are the differences in those? We're going to cover all of that in the next overview chapter, and we'll see you there.